to our hosts for giving us the space to speak tonight. Namaste, my name is Ashley Moore and I'm a devotee at the Sanatan Mandir in San Bruno. As a relatively new Hindu, I have had the opportunity to be the welcomed stranger many times, both in temples and in the private homes of fellow devotees. I confess I changed the speech last minute because of an experience I had while abroad in India just a few weeks ago that I felt was particularly illuminating when it comes to the subject of welcoming strangers into our midst. Originally, I was prepared to tell you about the ritual known as the 16-step puja, which mirrors how we are to treat strangers that come to our homes, or how the guest is revered as a god or a goddess. But there is theory, and then there is practice. And I'd like to tell you about the latter. When I promised my friend Keshu that I would visit his family during my next visit to India, I had some idea of what was in store for me. I knew he came from a rural village in Rajasthan, about 7 hours from the nearest major city. I knew his family relied on agriculture and that it had been a particularly difficult year for the crops. Keshu himself left school at the age of 12 to earn money so he could send it home. He was eager for me to see his village and to meet his family and his friends, people he had not seen in months. 5 hours on an overnight bus and 2 more on a tuk-tuk and we reached his village. Brick and mortar homes with sheet metal roofs lined with dirt paths. It was late when we arrived, about 3 in the morning, but Keshu's mother was up to greet us. Warm smiles and embraces all around. I was ushered across an open courtyard with a concrete floor into the only enclosed room in the home, the only room with a bed and a mattress, the room with a ceiling fan, and one of only 2 areas of the home with electricity. The rest of the family, which included Keshu's brother-in-law, sister, and 2 nephews, along with Keshu himself and his mother, slept on cots in what amounted to little more than an open-air shelter. They shared the space with the family goats. After a few hours of sleep, the sun was up, and what followed was a day I will never forget as long as I live. As we sat eating what would be one of many meals that day, the rumor spread. There was a visitor at Keshu Bhai's house. Invitations started coming in. Apparently, everyone wanted to have me over for chai. I was already full at this point, but I wasn't going to say no. One by one, we walked the dirt path to various relatives' homes, followed by a small army of children. And judging by their uniforms, they were on their way to school, but decided that I was worth skipping for. At each home, I was enthusiastically embraced by strangers, fed, and given a place of honor. Where there were no chairs, which often there were no chairs, blankets were heaped on the ground so that I would not have to sit on the concrete floor. Women handed me their babies to hold, not for photos, but just to hold. Children ran up to me and offered me snacks and flowers. Although I speak and understand some Hindi, the local dialect was a complete mystery to me, so my friend would often play translator. However, I kept hearing one phrase over and over again. Gori mosi aa gayi hai. Gori is the word for white people. So it means our white auntie has come. As I would leave one home for the next, the matriarch of the home would always demand that I stay one night, just one night with us. I'm 32 years old and I'm still getting invited to sleepovers. This repeated itself on the second day, visiting one relative after another, firing up the wood stove, making the chai, cooking the food. Someone is sent to the market to get sodas or bottled water. And always the smiles, always the laughter and the excitement. One woman, seeing the henna on my hands, demanded to paint more on my feet. Keshu disappeared at one point, only to reappear 20 minutes later with a beautiful Rajasthani skirt and blouse in hand, a gift for me. Not willing to be outdone, his sister arrives later in the day with another dress, ready to be fitted. All this was beginning to get very emotional for me because it's impossible for me to think about all the resources I'm using. It's impossible for me to say no, but also painful for me to accept their kindness because I know that they have so little. This reaches ahead at the last stop on my parade to the village. I'm taken to Keshu's future mother-in-law's house. Keshu isn't allowed to be in the same space or see his bride-to-be before the wedding, so I'm taken by other relatives to meet her while he stays behind. Before I leave, Keshu turns to me and says, "If you speak very slowly in Hindi, she will understand you." So you can imagine how that felt. For the sake of time, I'm leaving a lot out of the story, but at the end of our meeting with Keshu's bride-to-be, I get up to leave, and one of her relatives hands me a 200 rupee note, which amounts to about $1.75, which is almost the average pay for a lot of the working poor in India. I'm dumbstruck. I struggle to communicate in Hindi what I'm feeling. Maine kya kiya? Maine kuch खास nahi kiya hai. What have I done? I have done nothing important. One of Keshu's friends, sensing my discomfort, tries to explain. It's a gift for visiting, to thank you for visiting. Even though I'm surrounded by strangers, I fight to hold tears back. But it didn't end there. Between that moment and time I left the village, my friends' relatives had collectively gifted me nearly 1,000 rupees. And every time it was given to me, I could think of nothing else to say but thank you. Everyone begged me to stay longer, to come back. Bring your husband next time. Yes, bring Jijaji. Refers to my husband. In their eyes, my visit was a blessing. There was no hint of inconvenience or hardship experienced by anyone I met. In the Hindu faith, like in many others, welcoming the stranger is considered a sacred duty. But for us, strangers are not just people to be cared for. They are, in and of themselves, a blessing. Not because they have something to offer us, but because through our acceptance and celebration of them, we become better versions of ourselves. Thank you.
I'm so nervous. My name is Koraku. I'm from Japan. I've been here almost 8 years. And I'm Chief Abbot of Shingon International Order. And Shingon is not familiar for you. It's a 1,200 years history in Japan, and the first the pure Japanese Buddhism, and which is formed by order from an emperor 1,200 years ago. So I'm 55th successor, only one grandmaster in the United States, and also I'm an interfaith chaplain. And today I'd like to bring some inspiration from the Buddhism aspect, how to care, how to welcome the stranger. As you don't know, and Japan is very flexible country in terms of religious acceptance. So we usually, no doubt, celebrate Jesus on Christmas and go to temple to self-reflections. And then the first day of the year, we go to shrine to God to ask something for the better year this year. And we accept a lot of God and Buddhas, which came from and which has a diverse and different background all around the world. And we don't have any hesitation to accept and get involved in any religious activity in Japan. So the statistics said, what is your religion? Everyone said, I have no religion, but my family loves in philosophy of all religions. So that's another worry, the headache that we have. But after the March 11th, the huge earthquake attacked our nations, and which group was most dedicated to give support for the people, monks and priests, and any religious workers around the nations. They never ask which country they're from and which belief they are having. So we, in the last 5 years, from my view, we've been experiencing uncertainty already. So we're living on over a lot of shared values system. So totally different. But like I mentioned, and we don't care so much about who or which God, which Buddha you're believing in, but how to exercise over experienced philosophy. So, and in our belief system, we usually have a belief to Buddha, and we always ask something for God, and get accompanied with the guardians. So we have four different scales from the Tathagata, Buddha, God, and guardian. And I'm from esoteric Buddhism, so which illustrates and depends on the people's demands of faith, and several different kind of the belief system can support all of us. So we don't make a clear lines that what's the difference between God or Buddha and guardians and Tathagata. Tathagata is almost the animism. So we believe in the change of climate, and we believe the change of seasons, and the stars, and natural activities around us to celebrate all of us and always. Then in our definitions, what is a stranger? And a stranger who is totally lost or partially or temporarily lost their faith or their values, core values. Well, they need to bring their own values to a world or a community. But to someone who lost their belief is grounded as a stranger. So we think we are all stranger to a new values. You know, every moment, every second, we need to make a decision. You know, a series of decisions need to create a character. So the character is lost. Well, character creation of the character is lost because of the work, because of the relationship, because of the war, and anything happens to for everyone to stop and their journey and to be who I am and who can be seen and recognized by our community. So we, as I mentioned, and we are particularly in the Buddhism scene in Japan, and we take the religion as like a cane to see something, and sometimes they force them to follow off the making directions which way. So we are trained and we're educated to see stranger in the case, well, I'm lost. Okay, try to work on to find your values. Okay, over not your credentials, not your authority, just feelings or emotion. What did you feel about something in your key moment in your life? So the Buddhism and philosophy always used for guiding people to find out their own philosophy and own values before connecting to the shared values. That's what we need, you know. The people is tired of follow the authority, is collective, the values. But in Japan, again, and we are very famous, and everybody wants to visit Japan. We are very flexible and very kind because we are already, we always accept differences. So we are already living on the differences. That makes the whole entire Japan and Japanese culture. So the Buddhism in Japan is more acceptable and easy to accept and differences. So once a stranger and find they are stranger because I am nobody, I'm not belonging to anything, but physical location is not physical location is not making anyone to be stranger. And a stranger is just the temporary lost their way. So all temple, if you are visiting, just like the priest, like me, and just giving an opportunity to share time and think about own values, how to reconnect or to connect to other values. That's how we take care of the strangers. Thank you very much. I'm talking too much. And I'd like to pass the mic to...
Welcome. I am quite used to being in this space. This is my congregation and my synagogue, and just like Lionel said, I'm so grateful that you're all here tonight. What a lovely thing to do. There are only between 14 and 15 million Jewish people in the world. It's a very, very small minority of people. And one of the hallmarks of Judaism is welcoming the stranger. So if you think of this very small minority of people, and one of our hallmarks is welcoming the stranger, it makes sense that we are here tonight doing what we're doing. Providing hospitality and making people feel welcome is something that we learn from our Torah, from the Hebrew Bible. 36 times in different formulations, we are reminded to not wrong the ger. The ger is a word in Hebrew, the stranger. There's one verse in particular from Leviticus, which is the very middle of the 5 books of the Torah. It says, "When the strangers sojourn with you in your land, you shall not do wrong to them. The strangers who sojourn with you shall be with you as natives among you, and you shall love them as yourselves, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." This text is saying, wherever you go, you need to treat people the way that you want to be treated, because you know what it feels like to be a stranger. One of the ongoing themes of our tradition, and particularly for this holiday called Passover in the spring, is that we were slaves, that our people were slaves, our ancestors were slaves in Egypt, and then we were freed by God with Moses' help. And it's not that we should forget that or say we were strangers, we were slaves, and so we should treat everyone else like that. Our tradition tells us that we need to learn from that experience biblically, bring that into our lives, and do better. We need to treat people better, welcome people even more. And this consciousness is passed down through our generations, through our storytelling. And it truly is one of our sacred narratives. Another one is about Abraham and Sarah. And Abraham and Sarah were considered in our biblical story as the very first Jewish people. These are the first people who chose God, one God, chose to believe in one God, and that's the hallmark of Judaism, at least in its very narrow definition. But Abraham, so there's a story that goes that Abraham, having just accepted the covenant with God, this sacred relationship, he marked it by circumcision at the age of 99. So Abraham, recovering from the circumcision at the age of 99, was sitting in his tent, basically in the middle of nowhere. And he saw 3 men approaching. And instead of sitting where he was, and waiting for them to arrive, he got up and he went out to greet them, and he offered them water. And he and his wife talked, Sarah, they talked, and he asked her to prepare a meal for them, and she prepared this lavish meal of bread and delicious meat and all kinds of things to these people that they didn't even know. Our sages say that these men were not really men. Rather, they were angels or emissaries from God, messengers. Their job at the time was to let Abraham know that he was to father a child with Sarah. And in this moment, Sarah overheard the message, and our text says that she laughed. And her laughter leads to the name of their child, Isaac, which in Hebrew is Yitzhak, which is related to the word of laughter. So the hospitality that we show to strangers comes from this narrative. They didn't know anything about these men, or that they would bring good news. The only thing that they knew was that they needed to provide a place of rest and offer food, and this is part of who we are. There's a beautiful custom in Judaism among many that connects us to the story, and that is with the chuppah. There's a wedding canopy that has four poles and a cloth that goes over the top. And sometimes it's stationary, and sometimes you have 4 people holding each one, and the couple is standing underneath the chuppah. And one of the meanings behind this is so that we can be like our ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, with our tent sides open. And that oftentimes during weddings we talk about how the couple should be as hospitable to those around them with the doors of their house open, and be ready to accept all who come into their lives. It's just a nice little homily for what our wedding canopy looks like. So aside from the level of being individually welcoming, this idea is built into our Jewish communal life as well. And though it's something that's valued and comes out in a lot of different ways in our Jewish communal life. So the Union for Reform Judaism, the umbrella organization for all Reform congregations, which this is a Reform congregation, is a phrase called audacious hospitality, focusing on welcoming LGBTQ folks, those with disabilities, interfaith families, and those who have been floating around and might be interested in being part of a Jewish community. And this is something that our community has taken very seriously as well. And just in the past few years, we have narrowed down what our vision and our purpose is for Peninsula Temple Sholom. And we have this in a purpose vision statement, which says, Peninsula Temple Sholom is an inclusive Jewish community where everyone can find peace, inspiration, and their own connection to Judaism. And we live this out, again, in many different ways, and being part of the Peninsula Multi-Faith Coalition and our work doing social justice, supporting immigration, and supporting those who are homeless through Home and Hope and Call Primrose, and all of these different ways. This is how we as an institution here, and as well as our kind of overarching body umbrella organization also lives out this value of welcoming the stranger. Thank you.
Thank the organizers of this evening who brought us here tonight, because as the Jesuit Greg Boyle says, if we're not careful, God can get tiny. I think that's really true. So any of us who dare to speak of the mystery of God, we really need the experience and we need the perspectives of all traditions. And still, we know we will fall short. We who follow Jesus of Nazareth, later called the Christ, the Anointed One, we owe so much to the Judaic tradition. And had you not spoken ahead of me, I would have cited all of those same passages and more from the rich scriptures about welcoming the stranger. Jesus was, of course, a Jew, and so steeped in that same tradition which he lived and cherished. And we Christians believe that in Jesus we see the most transparent face of the divine. When we contemplate, meaning look long and lovingly at Jesus, we see what it is to be God in this world. So, what can I say of that in 8 minutes? Well, Jesus knew the expansiveness, the inclusiveness of God. And he knew how hard it would be for the likes of us to grasp that kind of extravagance. So Jesus, in his short 33 years on this planet, emphasized in his teachings and by his lived example that God is definitely not tiny. Jesus showed what it means to welcome others without condition, to notice them, to include them, and to cherish them. He really pushed the boundaries of hospitality. He was hanging out with sinners, apostates, outsiders, women, lepers, tax collectors, and even his enemies. And his refusal to separate worthy from unworthy eventually cost him his life. So the Gospels, which means good news, in those Gospels it's clear that Jesus gravitated always toward outsiders, toward the least, the ones on the edge of proper society. He touched lepers, he dined with outcasts, he treated women as equals, and he urged us to invite to our tables not our friends, brothers, kinsmen, or rich neighbors, but rather the lame, the blind, and beggars. Back in the year 2001, I was privileged to resettle many of the lost boys of Sudan. Gabriel was one of them, barely 18, having lived in refugee camps since the age of 5. Shortly after his arrival to San Jose, I asked what surprised him most about America. I was sure that he would say the cars, the computers, the abundance of food, or maybe even the fact that he had a bed to sleep in. But no, without even blinking, he answered me, "Sister, what amazed me the most? That anyone would welcome me like this." Later, Gabriel said to me, "You make me feel like a human being." Welcoming does that. It makes us feel human and healed and whole. Because what matters is not serving others, but seeing them, bringing them in, and being one with them. Jesus told stories that knocked the socks off of his listeners. It was the heretic who was the hero in the story of the Good Samaritan. Not the priest, not the religious teacher, but the foreigner was the one who showed compassion for the man beaten by bandits. In the parable of the Last Judgment, it came as total shock to both groups, the sheep and the goats, that whatever they had done for the least among them was what they had done or not done for God. Eternal life hinged on offering a glass of water, visiting the sick in prison, or welcoming strangers. And in fact, the Gospels are big on strangers, because in the Easter stories, no one ever recognized Jesus, not even his best friends. He appeared as an ordinary gardener, a fisherman, a cook, or a stranger on the road. God is all about downward mobility, choosing to identify with the least. And Jesus excludes no one. As the African proverb says, there's always room for those you love, even if the house is crowded. And once Jesus was inside of a home, teaching, and the place became so crowded that the only way to get in was literally to tear off the roof so that they could lower down a paralytic to be in Jesus' healing presence. Tearing the roof off from cultural barriers that keep us apart, I think that's a good metaphor for the subversive imperative to become more welcoming. This kind of welcoming is quite dangerous, since it's never appreciated by people who benefit from the status quo. The author Annie Lamont writes, "It is madness to wear ladies' hats in church. The ushers should issue hard hats. They should give us life preservers and lash us to the pews." In following Jesus, we abandon any hope of staying in our comfort zone. The early followers of Jesus actually managed to live this way. They held all possessions in common, they shared meals, they broke bread across all manner of social boundaries to form communities. Even the Roman historians described how remarkable that looked. But it didn't last long. By the 4th century, Christianity had become an acceptable, even prized religion. It eventually became an empire. Talk about losing sight of your mission. The example of Jesus, poor, itinerant, inclusive, and ultimately crucified for his refusal to narrow down God. That original revelation of God's goodness got twisted into a Jesus who was the Christ, a king in royal robes who controls who's in and who's out, and issues rules for getting into heaven. In the 20 centuries since Jesus walked this earth, There have been individuals, and yes, even some structures, that remind us how to be welcoming. We think of Francis of Assisi, or monks welcoming visitors to the monasteries as if they were Jesus himself, or Mother Teresa with the beggars in Kolkata. There have been, over the centuries, prophetic calls to return us back to a spirit of welcoming. Luther and Calvin insisted that welcoming refugees was a sacred form of hospitality. And bishops issue magnificent treatises on the rights of migrants. Quakers and Catholic workers refuse to arm themselves against enemies. And church buildings have historically been places of sanctuary, even for criminals. But let's be honest, history also shows Christians moving away, time and again, from universal hospitality. We revert instead to welcoming only our own kind, and thus we have the appalling history of Christians engaging in slavery, colonialism, racism, persecuting, expelling, and crusading against other faith traditions, allowing holocausts in Europe and Rwanda and South Sudan, all these so-called Christian countries. Today there are more migrants than ever, and they find no place on earth that truly welcomes them. We are tear-gassing families on our own border, wrenching children from their parents, building walls, and demonizing anyone who is other. I say we because we have not yet stood together as faith leaders to stop these things, or even challenge them with a strong, united voice, much less lay down our lives to protect the strangers in our midst. I am ashamed to say, in many so-called Christian countries, the other is now considered a threat rather than as our best chance to encounter the Holy One. We need conversion, and those of us who claim to follow Jesus must refuse to exclude others. There are so many traditions, so many names for God, so many paths to union. But God is always other, and God, in fact, is the ultimate other. When we welcome and cherish others, we welcome and cherish God, the holy other. Love reaches beyond all borders. Love welcomes strangers, even as it costs us everything. Thank you.
In the Baha'i faith, the stranger actually has a significance for a couple of reasons. Our prophet founder, Baha'u'llah, which means the glory of God, was in fact a stranger himself by way of his remoteness from his own land, his own country. He was banished from his country for most of his life, actually. And he was treated with injustice and cruelty with the people around him. However, he says that the cruelty and his remoteness, he uses that and asks God as a way for God to bring his servants and the people of God closer to his revelation. In one of his writings, he says, "O thou who holdest within thy grasp the kingdom of names and the empire of all things, thou seest how I have become a stranger from my land on account of my love for thee. I beg of thee by the beauty of thy countenance to make my remoteness from home a means whereby the servants may be drawn nigh unto the fountainhead of thy cause, and the day spring of thy revelation." Now, in another context, when we are talking about strangers within the community, within the Baha'i community, there are multiple references in the writings of the Baha'i faith regarding this topic. And there are in fact many references to the fact that we, human beings, were created from the same dust. This is obviously echoed by many of the scriptures of different religions. And the reason is that we are all equal, and no one should exalt himself over others. And this concept of the unity of mankind, the unity of humankind, is really central to the teachings of the Baha'i faith. I like to say that it's so central that all the other teachings really emanate from this when you read the scriptures of the Baha'i faith. In one of his talks while he was traveling in North America in the early part of the 20th century, the son of the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, his name was Abdul Baha, which literally means the servant of Baha, was his father. He gave us these insights regarding the stranger. Let all your strivings be for this, to become the source of life and immortality, and peace and comfort and joy to every human soul, whether one known to you or a stranger, one opposed to you or on your side. Look ye not upon the purity or impurity of his nature. Look ye upon all-embracing mercy of the Lord, the light of whose grace hath embosomed the whole earth and all who dwell thereon, and in the plenitude of whose bounty are immersed both the wise and the ignorant. Stranger and friend alike are seated at the table of his favor. Even as the believer, the denier who turneth away from God, doth at the same time cup his hands and drink from the sea of his bestowal. So, as we read in the Baha'i scriptures, the concept of the stranger actually transforms into one that upholds the dignity of human beings. Because we are all seen as reflections of the attributes and names of God. So in that light, we are all one. There is no stranger, there is no friend anymore. You see a lot of times in Baha'i activities, in Baha'i gatherings, in Baha'i communities, that strangers, non-Baha'is, come, and they're obviously welcomed, and they come and enjoy with the spirit of fellowship and harmony with the rest of the Baha'is. And if it's, for example, a holy day celebration or it's a prayer meeting, they come together as one. So when we see that there is no difference between a friend and a stranger in this light, and humanity is united, and when there is no prejudice of race or color, there is unity between religions, and there is harmony between the sexes, then humanity really excels, and humanity really reaches that objective that it was created for. I'd like to finish with a quotation from the founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah. In late 19th century, a very renowned professor of history he was an Orientalist from Cambridge University in England, decided to travel to Israel, in Haifa, where our founder was there at the time, to visit him because he was curious to see what the Baha'i faith was about. And he met with him 3 times. On one of the occasions, on the last occasion, this was part of the message that Baha'u'llah gave him. And I'd like to finish with this. This is what Baha'u'llah says. We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations, that all nations should become one in faith, and all men as brothers, that the bonds of affection and unity between the sons of men should be strengthened. That diversity of religion should cease, and differences of race be annulled. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come. These strifes and this bloodshed and discord must cease, and all men be as one kindred and one family. Let not a man glory in this, that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind. Thank you very much.
I am disappointed that my community is not represented. I am sorry. I really regret that very much. My wife and I, here just because it's an interfaith meeting.
And I give you 8 minutes.
No, 2 minutes is fine. 2 minutes because I have not prepared anything. I'll just extempore. But I was moved by what the rabbi was saying. And I was moved by you, sister. There is so much common between us. We could all say the same things in each of our beliefs, in each of our faiths. You started with the story of Abraham, and you called him the first Jew. We call him the first Muslim. The reason being that he was the first who believed in one God. It really matters little whether we call him a Jew or we call him a Muslim. You narrated the story of 3 visitors who gave him the blessings of Isaac. It is in the Holy Quran, whole elaborated in a whole chapter named after Abraham. But one of the interesting stories of Abraham was also that Abraham never ate alone. He always sought strangers and guests. And once a stranger came, and Abraham invited him for a meal. And then Abraham started the meal by saying, I begin in the name of God. The stranger said, hold on, this is not right. I don't believe in God. I'm not going to share the meal with you. And he got up and left, started leaving. Abraham was told by God, he is a stranger. Go and welcome him. Bring him back. He is a stranger. He is one of you. It matters little if he doesn't know me or doesn't believe in me. There are millions who don't believe in me. I feed them, I give them oxygen, I give them health, I give them life. Why should you differentiate just because he doesn't believe in me? I think that is where we all are. We are all the children of Adam and Eve. We're all brothers and sisters. We might take a different path, but we have to be together. And this community is really a wonderful opportunity, and I regret that we are not represented here. Just want to finish off by one story, since people have been telling stories, of how welcoming one should be of a stranger. And this is about the Prophet Muhammad, whom we believe in. In the Holy Mosque, he was sitting, and a stranger came, Bedouins in those days. And he went to a corner and started urinating in the mosque. And the people, the believers, went to him to stop him. And the Prophet said, no, he's a stranger. He doesn't know. Let him finish what he is doing. That is welcome. We may be different. We may have different ways of practicing our beliefs. But actually, at the end of the day, how close we are to our God, the Creator. That's what matters. Everything else is superficial. Thank you. And thank you for welcoming.